Hello and welcome to Azim Premji University's YouTube channel. My name is Sharmadip Basu and I'm a faculty member in the School of Arts and Sciences.
Hello, I am Kalyani, Assistant Professor at School of Arts and Sciences. So let me introduce Professor Satish Deshpande. Satish Deshpande retired as professor at the Department of Sociology, Delhi School of Economics, University of Delhi. Previously, he has worked at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies and the Institute of Economic Growth and the University of Hyderabad. He began his academic career as a teacher of economics, but abandoned his first doctoral thesis for another in sociology. He is the author of Contemporary India, a Sociological View, which has come out from Viking Penguin in 2003. His views are expressed through several op-eds, besides an array of research articles which he has published. So welcome, Professor. It's our pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here.
So, Professor Satish, your work has a pressing reflection on the questions of representation of marginalized students from SC, ST, OBC communities. In your work, you have discussed the banality of merit argument that is often whipped out to discourage marginalized students within the educational spaces. One of the recent reports has discussed the dropout of more than 25,000 students from top institutes like IIT, IIMs, and several other central universities. Given this pretext, to what extent do you think reservation has proved to be an enabling process? From the point of entry to point of survival within institutions, what have been the barriers that has failed reservation policy to deliver social justice? It would be great to have your reflection on this question.
Thank you. This is a very important question and a question that would need a broader view to be taken. We have to start with the size of the challenge in the Indian context, where programs like reservation, even if you restrict it only to higher education and not include jobs, is on a scale unimaginable anywhere else except China. So we have had the scale of our program of affirmative action, or whatever else you want to call it, of inclusion, basically social inclusion in higher education, has been easily the largest in the documented world, because there is very little documentation of what happened in China regarding this. So the challenges to be faced start at the school level, where in the 1970s, our school system got effectively segregated in class terms and also as a corollary in caste terms, with the affluent sections sending their children to private schools and the rest having to do with government schooling. Over time, this trend has only got worse. I'm mentioning school education in the context of higher education because that is where the basis of the educational inequalities, that is where the foundations are laid. And what we see in higher education is a downstream effect of these accumulated inequalities. And higher education then has the added challenge of making up for this educational deficit at the same time as promoting an inclusive and harmonious climate or culture within the institutions that it comprises of. This is an immense challenge. And on the whole, I think, comparing globally and comparing historically, I think the reservation policy had no alternative. We absolutely needed the reservation policy. But as your question is pointing out, there have been many blocks along the way. It has been a struggle. And let me mention some of the reasons why it has been a struggle. I think we forget today how the capability or the ability of higher education itself to affect social mobility has changed in the era of what is often called neoliberalism. I'm using the term as a descriptive term for a change in the policy ideologies of government policies, which shifted from being social welfare oriented and interventionist attitudes to a market-centric approach, where the job of governments was to keep markets free and to assist markets in whatever way possible, withdrawing from to a large extent, withdrawing from direct intervention in social welfare initiatives. In this kind of a situation, we have had growth of a particular kind, where at one time it was called jobless growth, and today it is being called job loss growth, where growth in statistical terms is able to be managed by large corporate entities that now control most of the world economy without needing to create too many jobs. So you have the numbers in terms of growth showing a lot of progress, if you like, or a lot of wealth creation, as the current phrase goes, but not resulting in jobs. And this is happening outside the higher education sector. And often when we look at the higher education sector, we blame the higher education sector for what is happening in the rest of the economy. So I for one am very suspicious and skeptical about terms like employability and how they get used at particular times to explain away the inability of industry to create jobs and to pass the blame on to higher education. Yes, we have a problem of quality in higher education. We have had it for a long time. And the problem is perhaps worse in our case than in many other comparable contexts across the world. But we still have to remember that the ability of higher education to deliver on the expectations it generates has been crippled by forces outside of higher education. After having taken that into account, the story of reservation has been one of slow but inexorable, one might use that word, success. So that more and more institutions have got covered and more attention has been paid to the way in which the policy is implemented. The single biggest obstacle to the success of the reservation policy in higher education as much as in jobs, but perhaps more so in higher education, has been the entrenched attitudes of animosity and antipathy towards reservation policy on the part of those who control higher education, namely the already entrenched elite castes. And these attitudes have enjoyed a lot of social legitimacy. And they even today, they enjoy a lot of social legitimacy. It's okay and even expected of you as a member of the high caste, or so-called higher caste, to be critical of reservation. Even if you consider yourself a liberal and progressive in other matters, on reservation, you're supposed to oppose it. So there is that built-in reservoir of opposition and resistance to the implementation of that policy. That has been the single biggest obstacle. We have had a shift of the problem from one of the absence of bodies, absence of particular groups in higher education. That has been largely addressed by, in the last decade, finally, by reservation policy. But now we have the frontier that is now being faced is that of inside institutions, invisible barriers to the full inclusion or the full participation of the newly included groups. So what are called soft barriers or cultural barriers, rather than specifically institutional barriers, are being erected. These need to be named. These need to be made visible. They'll tend to be largely invisible. And they, of course, need to be broken. That is where I see the challenge as lying in front of us. And the biggest tragedies that we see in terms of dropouts, suicides, and other such things are a symptom, they are the tip of the iceberg of a much larger problem of cultural, attitudinal opposition to the inevitability of reservation as a legal policy. So the resistance has moved to non-extra-legal cultural domains. So the naming of these invisible barriers, they need to be described, and they need to be, social movements need to be launched inside institutions, including by sections of the privileged groups, to break down these barriers.
If I may add another question on this topic, we are also living in a moment where privatization of higher education is apace. How do you see these soft barriers being negotiated in a context where you do not have the institutional mandate for representation in the form of affirmative action and reservation?
Yes, that is a question that the answer to which is taking shape still. It has not coagulated, it has not settled into, crystallized into a proper answer. I will say that privatization, the primary barrier it erects is financial. That already preselects only a certain segment of the population. But as with all social groups, we do have now a sizable elite, not sizable in proportional terms, but sizable in terms of absolute numbers because of our huge country, where even a small proportion of the kinds of numbers we have amounts to a large absolute number. So we have now the situation where, on the one hand, high fees erect a sort of barrier that keeps out the majority of the disprivileged sections. Of the ones that do get in, it's now a question to be researched as to what extent has the class identity or the entry into a particular class helped to soften the resistance to the caste identity of a new entrant into an upper class. And it's also a test of these new institutions to see whether their institutional cultures are able to create a climate of genuine inclusion. But this is something that is ongoing, and I don't know if we can as yet pronounce verdict on what is possible or what is not possible. But the primary effect of privatization is to raise the financial ask and thereby restrict access to the institutions to only the upper classes of every community. Now, within that upper class, how much mixing there can really be, this is a test of the new private institutions.
Thank you very much. Professor Deshpande, you've been a perceptive commentator on the trajectory of reservation in the post-Mandal phase. In a 2006 EPW article, you discussed the problem of the OBC reservation system, taking a broad, wide-angle view on the issue. And you argued that while the upper OBC, that is the creamy layer, have distanced themselves to an extent and have even become active critics in some case of the reservation system, for the lower OBC, it has been a different experience altogether. The fracture within the OBC that you have discussed has largely been about class within caste. However, later, the Rohini Commission has also discussed the differential access to the resources that different subcaste groups face within the large blanket term of ABC. Can you share your thoughts on sub-categorization that is proposed by the Rohini Commission? Do you think that this sub-categorization or this effort to create new categories within existing caste formations will work in tandem with the spirit of Mandal Commission?
Yes, this is again a very topical question because in the last 20 years, let's say in the 21st century, which is well into the neoliberal era, the generation of the deepening of inequalities has proceeded at great pace across the world and also in India. So as a result of that, existing tendencies or processes, social tendencies towards differentiation within social groups have been intensified. So every group now has a very differentiated profile. It has within it many different classes. And this is true for all groups, even though the proportions involved may be very different for the Dalit castes or the Adivasis or even the OBCs compared to the so-called upper castes. But the fact of differentiation exists for all groups. So in a country like ours, sub-categorization becomes almost an inevitability, in my opinion, and needs to be looked at with an open mind. However, sub-categorization of something like reservation needs to be done in a context-sensitive manner, and specific problems arising for specific groups in specific contexts need to be kept in mind before drawing up concrete plans for sub-categorization. I have not had access to the Rohini Commission reports.
I don't think it's been made public yet.
So I can't comment on that. But in general, I think that sub-categorization is an inevitability and has to be dealt with in a context-sensitive manner. And the thing to remember with respect to an earlier era. That is, we are in a position now to already speak of the 1990s as a different era when the Mandal moment happened. That the tendency at that point was to try and, in a sense, recapture the ground lost to reservation on the part of the so-called general category. The effort was to recapture the seats or the territory lost to reservation by using various pretexts and sub-categorization. The pointing towards intra-group differentiation or differences was one way to argue against the policy of reservation in toto. Temptations of that sort need to be avoided, but I think the climate has changed enough that those arguments don't work in the way that they used to. Since you mentioned the 2006 article, I must also say that from 2006 to now, attitudes have changed within the upper sections of the OBCs. I don't think there is any longer any embarrassment about reservation. Whatever residual embarrassment there may have been has been laid to rest with the EWS reservation. So the most well-off and the most powerful of the OBCs have no hesitation in claiming reservation today. This was not so in 2006. So that no longer holds today. But yes, given that differentiation is a fact for every group, there has to be a response to that in the form of subcategorization. But this has to be done as a within-group measure rather than used as an excuse to transfer things across groups.
That's very interesting, Professor Satish, that you talk about subcategorization and how things can be brought out. On that note, let me talk something about caste census. You wrote an interesting op-ed sometimes back, which was titled as "Who is Afraid of Caste Census?" In fact, you have argued the importance and relevance of having statistics on caste, particularly in a neoliberal context, as it will generate a clearer picture which caste group were actually able to mobilize themselves within a post-Mandal era and which caste groups were actually left behind. This is also important as it will also provide a clearer picture as to who has access and distribution of the resources among the different sub-caste communities that exist today. And this can give us a better picture of how we can deliver the question of social justice. Now, my question to you is, what do you think are the present-day bottlenecks to caste census and who actually is afraid of caste census? In this context of reservation, it is again a strange paradox that while there is a selective political silence on caste census question, there was an unanimous support to EWS quota even from parties like BSP and SP. Do you think EWS has diluted the essence of reservation policy? And to what extent does the question of caste belong within the schema of caste-based discrimination? If we can have your reflection on that.
That's actually a double-barreled question. There are two questions in one, right? So let's start by separating out the EWS, which is a very important question, from the question of the caste census. Now, this is a battle in which I have been I'm now used to being on the losing side. We fought this from the 2001 census, 2011 census, and we tried for the non-census of recent years, but COVID kind of intervened decisively and has scuttled that. My views have, that's already, we're talking nearly 3 decades, it's more than 2 decades anyway. So again, my views have evolved over this period. You can divide the justifications for a caste census, broadly speaking, into 2 kinds. One is an instrumental justification, where the caste census is not an end in itself, but it will help as a means to the implementation of social justice policies by providing better database, things like that. So these are what I call instrumental reasons for the caste census. And there is already a well worked out argument for that better data will help social welfare programs to be better targeted. I have always been a little skeptical of that argument. And in this case, EWS reservation is an excellent example because a major new reservation policy was introduced with zero data. So the absence of data does not prevent these programs from being implemented. The question is one of political will. And the absence of data is almost always an excuse that is used. In the case of the courts who have often asked for data, I also think that it is no longer a tenable argument because the courts have found EWS acceptable despite there being no evidence for it. So the instrumental reasons are, to my mind, not really decisive, although they are right. The arguments are right, but I don't think they carry much weight today. What carries weight for me today is something that is an unpopular and perhaps also an unusual argument. I think that the caste census today should also be treated as an end in itself, not for some other benefit that it is going to bring about. And I say this because I think we are in a situation today where we need to think about what is it that we get from the census and why is it important to introduce caste into the census. If you think about it, the census is the only broadly social scientific project which has the full backing of the state, including a very strong legal backing. As researchers, we all dream of being able to tell our respondents that you better answer my questions, otherwise this or that will happen to you. Obviously, we can't do that. But the Census Act of 1948 allows for 6 months of imprisonment if you refuse to answer the census questionnaire. So it has the backing of the state. Evidence given, information given to the census enumerator is protected from the Indian Evidence Act. It cannot be used against you as evidence in a court of law. So I'm just giving this as examples of the very strong legal support that the census has. And of course, the census is the only exercise of this kind which is universal. It covers everybody who is here in this country. An exercise like that is a collective mirror that we hold up to ourselves. And as part of that exercise, I feel today it is imperative for every citizen to be asked to state their caste, to therefore make it impossible for people to pretend that at least some of them live somewhere outside caste, and that the problem of caste is essentially the problem of the lower caste, the so-called lower castes, and that we, the general category, are above all this. In a small way, a census question which you have to answer, and which you can answer by saying you have no caste, or as Amitabh Bachchan was saying, you can say, Meri Jati Hindustani. But when you say Meri Jati Hindustani, you are, in a sense, saying what your caste is, because as I have argued for a long time, it is an objective fact that only members of certain castes have had the experience of thinking of themselves as casteless. That luxury has not been available to the vast majority of the population, because the whole world is telling you what caste you are, even if you wish to forget your caste. So I think that the caste census today is a way of naming caste publicly and accepting the fact that regardless of our personal relationship to the institution of caste, that we have caste in the eyes of the world. And I think that's what the census is important for today.
And your reflection on, further reflections on EWS?
Ah, yes, EWS, yes. It's, I think, a very profound moment in the history of social justice legislation. It's a profound moment, and I think it is a sad moment. It marks an ending of a certain sort. And in fact, in one of my articles, I called this EWS the Antyeshti, the last rites of reservation as a social justice instrument. Now, with EWS, the legitimacy granted to the EWS reservation, the policy of reservation has become officially finally and irrevocably a social welfare program. It is no longer a program for social justice. Social justice programs are meant to address social injustice. And anything that is trying to address injustice cannot be even-handed. You cannot say, here is something for the oppressor, here is something for the oppressed. That is not social justice. You have to have a differential program. That's what social justice is about. That's what addressing inequality is about. If you distribute things equally, inequality will never go away. And reservation was the only significant government program that allowed for a conscious, built-in, compensatory inequality. Now, the EWS puts all this to an end. And we are saying everybody, the phrase revdi was used recently. So ye revdiya bad rahi hai. So everybody will get your share of revdi. If you make enough noise, you will also get revdi. So reservation as a social justice program is dead. And its death is announced by EWS. This is not to say that there are no poor upper castes or that they don't deserve some assistance from the state and so on. But providing assistance to the upper castes in a program that was meant to address caste inequality kills the program as an instrument of social justice.
Oh, that's really insightful reflection, Professor Satish, about what the what reservation was meant for, and how the question of social justice actually gets diluted within this framework of EWS.
Not diluted, it is killed.
So I correct myself, killed within this.
Because there are any number of other programs. See, our entire development process has been for the poor, without distinction, right? And look where it has got us. So reservation was the one program that made distinctions. And now there is no program which makes distinctions.
Absolutely, Professor Satish. I completely agree with you there. So let me talk to you, Professor Satish, now about a more topical and more discussed issue of the inclusion of Dalit Christians and Dalit Muslim within the scheduled caste category. So I want to ask you, do you think that bringing caste and religion together on a topic like reservation is more politically driven to fracture the solidarity among marginalized identities, especially when the present dispensation is investing heavily in post-Mandal outreach? Also, we would like to know, how do you address some of the concerns raised about overcrowding the scheduled caste category on one hand and the demand for the inclusion within it on the grounds of its putative religious neutrality raised by Dalit Muslims, Dalit Christians advocates on the other?
No, this is something that I have studied quite extensively. And in fact, more than articles, I would think of the study that I did for the National Commission on Minorities in 2008 as the place where I have dealt with this question in great detail. I personally think that this is an anomaly in our legal system, in our constitutional system, that keeping out Dalit Muslims and Dalit Christians from the reservation policy has never had, to my mind, any solid justification. The usual arguments given that religion cannot be grounds for caste reservation, caste-based reservation. If that is the reason, how is it that Sikhs were included? How is it that Buddhists were included, who are acknowledged to be different religions? If the argument is that the presidential order cannot be amended, it has been amended twice, and it can be amended again. And in general, we lead the world in the matter of amendments, although we have had only one constitution. In what is it, about 70 odd years, we have amended it how many times? 113 or something. 13, 114, something of that, which shows that we are willing to be flexible where the constitution is concerned. So those arguments don't hold. Finally, the numbers involved are very small because the community that has a large proportion as Dalits is the Christian community. but the Christian community is a little over 2% of the population of India. And while Muslims are a larger proportion of the population, roughly 14%, the proportion of Dalit Muslims, on the basis of the available statistics that we have, which are admittedly not very solid, because it has never been a recognized category, it has never been counted. But nevertheless, whatever guesstimates we have point to it being less than 1% of the Muslim population. Claims about the proportion of Dalits among Christians vary, and they are much more than, of course, they are not in the level of 1%, a minimum of, let's say, 30% to claims range up to 70%. So if we take a median of about 50%, we are talking about half of 2.3%. So net, we are talking about an increase in this of definitely less than 2%, closer to 1.2 or 1.3%. Consider the fuss that is being made on the possibility of increasing the SC quota by 1.3%, with the ease with which 10% of EWS reservation was granted without anybody raising their eyebrows. So I feel that the arguments brought against Dalit Muslim, Dalit Christians tend to be excuses. And especially in the present climate, it is about the distinction, the spurious distinction, in my opinion, in this context, between Indic and non-Indic religions. And the determination of a particular formation to deny so-called non-Indic religions any possible concession from the state, even though our constitution is meant to treat all religions equally. So I really think this is an anomaly, and it is something of a scandal that we have allowed this to continue for so long. So I for one I have been always for the inclusion of Dalit Muslim, Dalit Christians, especially when we look at there being no bar of religion for the Adivasi category, the scheduled tribe category, which is as it should be. So why can't the same be there for the scheduled caste category? About the question of Pasmanda outreach, I'm not sure that there is any heavy investment going on. There is some feelers being raised, being held out, and a possibility is a trial balloon has been sort of put up to see what happens. I don't see any concrete programs, and I don't see anything substantive emerging at this point. It's more a question of, I think that, and I think this is a fact, so it can be said that under Narendra Modi, the first time a prime ministerial candidate, a national level candidate has fought an election, and his party has fought an election with the explicit understanding that we do not want the votes of a particular community. While that might have been the attitude before, it was never said openly. Everybody's vote was wanted because that was part of being part of the nation. So since 2014, we are in the first time in the history of our constitutional republic that we have had an open campaign saying that the votes of a particular community are not wanted. The alleged Pasmanda outreach is, in my opinion, an attempt to balance that, to balance this aggressive position that we don't want your votes, but we will be very sensitive to the caste discrimination that you show to the unfortunate members of your community, whom we will graciously help. So I don't see this as something that needs to change any of our views about the propriety of including Dalit Muslims and Dalit Christians in the reservation category. I think the two are working at very different levels. There might be political issues to consider in this, what would happen with Pasmanda outreach, whether if it is pursued seriously. This is also linked to the larger question that I have raised in various fora about this being, in a sense, the whole Hindutva agenda has been to project the unity of the Hindu community as being sustainable, politically sustainable, necessary at the present moment. And this has worked to a great extent. But its test is whether it is able to offer real space to the hitherto excluded castes. That is its promise. But we see still atrocity against Dalits going on. We still see no particular change in the position of Adivasis. And of course, I don't think Pasmanda Muslims will fare any better than other Muslims in this context. So while there may be political aspects of this question to discuss, I don't think this has any bearing on the appropriateness or the legitimacy of including Dalit Muslims and Dalit Christians under reservation.
What do you think is the future of horizontal solidarities amongst historically marginalized caste groups within established religious communities?
Yes, that has been a question for a while. I think that you have to look at the contrast class. Horizontal solidarities against whom? Because every political mobilization requires another. And this is not necessarily a physically hostile thing. I'm talking about the cognitive sort of organization of a political campaign. Has to be in terms of we and them, a construction of a we and them. And we have to think about what will be the them against which a horizontal mobilization can take place. The success of the elite of various kinds in our society has been that it has made it very difficult for the them to find purchase, to find traction on our political ground. And while there are always references to those who sit in ACs and elite class and English speaking and other such ways of defining, these are conveniently vague. They don't usually mention caste. When they mention caste, they find it difficult to include others who are also excluded by the other side. So, I mean, you're asking a very difficult question, a very consequential question. The future of our country depends on the possibility of horizontal solidarities. But I think that the crystallization of horizontal solidarities depends on the crystallization of another. And the crystallization of an other has been successfully postponed, prevented, and so on by the maneuvers of the elite so far. And we are waiting for new political leaders. We are waiting for a new political language that can carry the burden of horizontal solidarities. But it is a major challenge today in our society.
Professor Deshpande, I have the privilege of asking you the final question of this extremely intellectually bracing conversation that we've been having. And it's a question on a personal note as far as the institutional perspective of Azim Premji University is concerned. Ever since the inception of our undergraduate program in 2015, your landmark 2013 EPW essay, Caste and Castelessness, towards a biography of the general category, which you alluded to before in the conversation as well, has featured as a required reading in the common curriculum that we have. We are proud to say that every single student who's graduated from our program has engaged with this particular essay of yours. This is also the 10th anniversary of that essay's publication. Could you share with us what motivated you, what provoked you to write this essay? To us, your account of how Savarna castes cashed in on their traditional caste capital into modern forms of capital and the historical emergence of the general category in the post-Mandal phase has remained a compelling argument as it was 10 years ago as it is today. How do you look back from the distance of a decade on that particular essay of yours, and if you can share your thoughts in that regard?
I don't know whether to thank you for this question, because I have to start by feeling, sharing with you my sense of great inadequacy. That, as you're saying, the distance of 10 years is a long distance. And I feel I should have been able to do much more on this question than I have been able to. So I must begin with a sense of unfulfilled expectations from myself, which I hope now post-retirement to address. So let me begin by talking about how that essay came about. Of course, the particular moment was I was to give a lecture for a particular award, the Malcolm Hadi Seshaya Award, and I put together things that I had been thinking and talking about for a while. But in terms of my own experience, it arose out of the sense of, how shall I put it, an intellectual sense of shock that I experienced in Hyderabad during the Mandal agitation, or rather the anti-Mandal and then the anti-Mandal agitations that happened. As a student of the social sciences and as somebody who had spent time in a rural development organization for 2 years in rural Rajasthan, I knew all about caste. In fact, I knew a fair amount of it firsthand in ways that most urban Indians, perhaps of my class and caste background, perhaps would not have known. So caste itself was not new to me, but I didn't think I participated in caste. I didn't think I had caste. I knew the name of the caste to which I was supposed to belong, but I always felt that that did not define me, that I was not made by that identity. The Mandal moment made me realize that that feeling I had was a marker of the caste identity that I inhabited. That experience, I was not lying to myself. It was true at a certain level, but it was true only for people like me, who in a sense had led very sheltered lives because of the kinds of jobs, public sector jobs that my father had. We were surrounded by people of our own caste. And this is not an unusual experience for people of the so-called upper caste. We are often in situations where we are surrounded by our own. And because we are surrounded by our own, we feel that we are all the same and we have no caste identity as such. So in a sense, that shock that it's only I who think this and only I who's enabled to think like this, where the rest of the world sees me as a inhabitor of my caste identity. That was a epiphanic moment for me. And in a sense, that has shaped my work. So that's where it came out of. It came out of that shock. I cannot claim that I was always headed in this direction. No, that was not true. So this was entirely a product of the Mandal movement. And I have to say, all the people around me at that time who helped me to think about this and whom I have partially acknowledged in the essay were responsible for this. But looking back at it from the distance of 10 years, I can see many shortcomings, some of which were visible to me at that time, some of which have become visible since. Firstly, this was intended as a, what is it called, an advance payment, so to speak. You know, it was meant as the first installment of something that where more would follow. And as I said, as I started by saying, the more has not followed yet. And so clearly, I have a debt to fulfill. The most obvious debt, of course, is that this was intended as a initial exploration. So detailed citation of all the other work that was being done in that area. Even at that time, a little bit more work that has to be done. Since then, a fair amount of work has been done on castelessness, and that has to be taken account of. One of the criticisms of this article, which is a legitimate criticism, is that I speak of castelessness for the upper caste elite as though it were a total policy, as though it were applicable for all times and places that these people occupied. And this is clearly not so. And many people have pointed this out, including notably Ajanta Subramaniam in her book and several others. So, this is absolutely true, that castelessness becomes available to a particular segment of the upper castes in a particular context, it's not necessarily invoked in all contexts. There are contexts where the upper castes insist on their caste identities quite aggressively. And that is, in fact, the areas where that happens have expanded in recent times, so that the upper castes are no longer hesitant in flying the caste flag, so to speak. We need a more detailed description of this phenomenon, and we need a more disaggregated sense of what is happening to the so-called upper castes. I feel that by and large, the biggest imbalance in our literature on caste, which is vast, by the way, and quite rich, the social science literature on caste is quite rich. But as yet, we have a surprisingly thin description of how caste privilege works. We have numerous accounts of how caste disprivilege produces its effects, but we have very little on caste privilege. And that I see as an urgent task for social science, and of course for me myself in the time to come, where accounts of privilege must be prevented from becoming a kind of celebration or a narcissism of sorts, where you celebrate your upper caste, the virtues of the upper castes. It has to not be that. At the same time, the descriptions have to be such that they have a, yes, let me use the word, an emancipatory possibility of undoing this privilege. And this is, of course, a very big ask, to produce descriptions of privilege that hold within them the seeds or the indications of how such privilege might begin to be deconstructed, begin to be dismantled, so that it doesn't reproduce itself repeatedly. That I see as the central challenge in front of us. More broadly, a term which has gained a lot of traction recently, but which I fear is used in a very partial and often in a plainly wrong way, is intersectionality. This is another big frontier in social science today. Intersectionality as a term originated in a very particular context, and it was meant to signal the effective disappearance of a category due to the intersectionality. Specifically, women of color in the US situation vanished from the discourse on gender because of their race, and vanished from the discourse on race because of their gender. It's this vanishing effect that intersectionality as a term was intended to flag, to foreground. This is not necessarily true of other contexts. And the term intersectionality is being, I feel, applied indiscriminately across contexts where this disappearance is not the point. And it has also been applied in a one-sided way. Intersectionality seems to mean only an accumulation of disadvantages. Whereas in practice, what we see as the most consequential social forces today are countervailing intersectionalities. You are low on the caste axis, you may be high on the class axis. What sort of a social animal do you then become? Or you can take many such instances. You are of the weaker gender or the more powerless gender, but you are of a higher caste or a higher class. What sort of a group do you then become? So we need a much more disaggregated, a much more context-specific account of intersectionalities. And we need to think of them not as a matrix or a table where by definition rows and columns will intersect. Their intersection is trivial in that context. But we need non-trivial instances of intersection, and we need descriptions of those. And these must be both ways, not only the accumulation of disadvantage, but also what happens with the accumulation of advantage, and most importantly, the juxtaposition of a relative advantage and disadvantage along different axes. So I see that also as a major challenge for the social sciences. And of course, we have our eternal problem of great regional diversity. So we need to tell the stories of intersectionalities, of caste, of so many other things in region-specific ways. And here I'll mention the final frontier of language. In many ways, it is a curse to have so many rich languages from a social science point of view, because by the time you begin, for various historical reasons, competences in social science, or at least the recognized kinds of competences in social science, have been largely restricted to the English language. So the English language has had a completely legitimate gatekeeping function in the production of legitimate, consequential, important social science descriptions. We need descriptions that are social scientifically valid, valuable, rich in languages other than English. And then we will see a threshold broken. We will see other worlds that we have no sense of their existence today. These are some of the horizons that we have to look to in the future. And I see myself as a small cog in this large enterprise.
Thank you, Professor Satish. I think that's really insightful to know about each of the social categories that you're talking about, the intricacies of it, the complexity of it, and how to deal with, how to talk about it, how to engage with such concept, rather than looking it as a very sweeping or looking at it in terms of a very generalized way. Thank you again for talking on array of things. You started from talking about reservation to questions of representation, EWS, to topical issues like Dalit Muslims, Dalit Christians issue. Thank you very much for your engagement.
And we hope to have you back with us soon and keeping this conversation going and alive. And thank you for the wager that you've put to us as practitioners of the social sciences. And hopefully we'll be able to, if not make entirely good on it, but to proceed in baby steps in those directions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both. It was wonderful talking to you, and I hope to continue the conversation in future.